The ship's landing thrusters kicked up clouds of purple dust as it touched down on NS-227. Tom Reed watched through the reinforced window as the alien landscape came into view. This was his 15th expedition to a new world, but something about this one felt different. The planet's twin suns cast strange shadows across the crystalline formations that dotted the landscape. Final system check complete. Environmental reading stable, announced the ship's eye. Though I must remind you, Dr. Reed, that this planet has a level 9 danger rating. Tom smiled as he put on his environment suit. After 10 years as a xenobiologist, he had learned that danger ratings didn't tell the whole story. The suit sealed with a soft hiss, and he performed his usual safety checks while looking at the data scrolling across his helmet display. Doctor, the Council strongly advises against this expedition, came a voice through his comm. It belonged to Ambassador Rax, a tall, blue-skinned alien who represented the Galactic Research Council. We've lost 3 research teams here already. The glints cannot be studied. They cannot be contained. With all due respect, Ambassador, Tom replied, checking his equipment one last time. That's exactly why I'm here. Every species that's tried to study the glints has approached them as creatures to be captured and contained. Maybe that's why they failed. The airlock cycled, and Tom stepped onto the purple soil of NS-227. The crystalline formations he'd seen from above were even more impressive up close. They jutted from the ground like frozen waterfalls, reflecting the dual sunlight in mesmerizing patterns. His scanner beeped, detecting movement. About 50 meters away, something shifted among the crystals. Tom activated his suit's recording systems and stood perfectly still. What emerged made his breath catch in his throat. The glint was beautiful. Its body seemed to be made of living crystal, transparent in some places and opaque in others. It moved with liquid grace, its form shifting and flowing like water made solid. As it moved, light danced across its surface in complex patterns. Dr. Reed. Ambassador Rax's voice was tense in his ear. 3 galactic standard years ago, a creature exactly like the one you're observing killed an entire research team of 15 scientists. Please return to the ship. But Tom noticed something the others hadn't mentioned in their reports. The glint wasn't approaching randomly. It was following a specific path between the crystal formations. Every few steps, it would pause and emit a brief pulse of light that reflected off the surrounding crystals. Ambassador, Tom whispered, I don't think it's hunting. It's communicating. He took out a small recording device and carefully set it on a nearby rock. The glint stopped moving and turned toward him. Its crystalline body shifted, creating new facets that caught the sunlight. Previous reports said they attack anything that enters their territory. Tom narrated quietly into his suit's recorder. But this one's behavior suggests curiosity rather than aggression. The glint moved closer, and Tom could hear Ambassador Rax shouting for him to retreat. Instead, he slowly sat down on the purple ground, making himself as non-threatening as possible. The creature paused, then emitted a complex series of light pulses. Fascinating, Tom murmured. It's not just random reflections. There's a pattern to the lights, almost like. His voice trailed off as he noticed something extraordinary. The glint had positioned itself so that its light pulses were creating a similar pattern to the one he'd seen it use with the natural crystal formations. Dr. Reed. Ambassador Rax's voice was frantic now. You must return immediately. We're detecting more glints approaching your position. Tom looked around and saw them. 3 more crystalline forms emerging from behind different formations, but they weren't charging or attacking. They were moving in the same measured way as the first one, each following specific paths between the crystals. No, Ambassador, Tom said calmly, a smile spreading across his face. I don't think I will be returning just yet. I think I've just been invited to observe something remarkable. As the sun set on his first day on NS-227, Tom Reed began to understand why all previous attempts to study the glints had failed. Everyone had been so focused on capturing them. They'd missed the most important thing. These weren't just predators to be contained. They were an intelligent species with their own way of communicating, and he was possibly the first human to notice. 3 days had passed since Tom Reed's first encounter with the glints. He sat in his small observation post, surrounded by monitoring equipment and half-eaten food packets. The post was nothing more than a clear dome set on a rocky outcrop, but it gave him the perfect view of the crystal fields below. "You're wasting valuable research time," Dr. Wells said through the comm system. As the expedition's lead scientist, she hadn't approved of Tom's methods. "We could have captured a juvenile glint by now if we used the containment fields." Tom didn't respond immediately. He was too focused on recording the behavior of a group of glints in the valley below. Through his high-powered scanner, he watched as they moved crystals around in what seemed like a deliberate pattern. "Look at this," he finally said, transmitting the feed to the main ship. "They're not just walking between the crystals. They're farming them." On the screen, 3 glints worked together to position a large crystal formation. Once it was in place, they moved around it in a complex dance, their bodies pulsing with light. Gradually, smaller crystals began growing around the larger one. "That's impossible," Dr. Wells muttered, but Tom could hear the curiosity in her voice. "Crystals don't grow that fast." "They do when the glints tend to them," Tom replied, making another note in his observation log. "I've counted 14 different light patterns they use. Each one seems to affect crystal growth in a different way." His scanner beeped, alerting him to movement near his observation post. A young glint had separated from its group and was approaching this position. Unlike the adults, its crystalline form wasn't fully developed, showing swirling patterns of growth within its transparent body. "Tom," Dr. Wells warned, "don't do anything stupid." The young glint stopped at the base of his observation post. It tilted its crystalline form upward, studying him with what Tom could only describe as curiosity. Then it did something unexpected. It began arranging small purple stones from the ground into a pattern. Tom quickly sketched the pattern in his notebook. It was similar to one he'd seen the adult glints use in their crystal gardens. When the young glint finished, it stepped back and emitted a series of light pulses. "It's trying to communicate," Tom whispered, excitement making his hands shake as he documented everything. "They don't just talk with light. They use patterns too, like a written language." The young glint waited, as if expecting a response. Tom looked around his post and spotted his spare sample containers. They were made of clear material, similar to the glint's crystalline structure. Careful not to make any sudden moves, he took 3 containers and climbed down from his post. "Dr. Reed, this is extremely dangerous," Dr. Wells said, but her voice had lost its stern edge. Tom arranged the containers in a pattern similar to what the young glint had made, then used his suit's external lights to create a simple pulse pattern he'd seen the glints use. The young glint's body shifted, creating new facets that caught the sunlight. It moved closer and adjusted one of Tom's containers slightly. "They're not just intelligent," Tom said, recording everything with his suit's cameras. "They're teachers. This little one is correcting my pattern." For the next hour, Tom and the young glint exchanged patterns. Each time, the glint would make adjustments, showing him the correct way to arrange things. Other glints had gathered at a distance, watching but not interfering. "Dr. Wells," Tom said, unable to keep the excitement from his voice, "I need you to see something in my observation logs from the past few days. These patterns the glints make, they're not random. They repeat every time they work with specific types of crystals. I think we're looking at their technology, not just their language." As the second sun began to set, casting long shadows across the crystal fields, Tom realized he had just witnessed something unprecedented. He wasn't just observing the glints anymore. He was learning from them. And somehow, despite centuries of failed attempts by other species, humanity's peaceful approach was finally opening a door to understanding these remarkable creatures. A week had passed, and Tom's observation post was now covered in drawings, charts, and crystal samples. He had barely slept, too excited by each new discovery about the glints. His tablet displayed maps of their territories, each marked with different colored lines showing their crystal garden paths. "The Council wants an update," Ambassador Rax said through the comm. "They're surprised by your survival." Tom smiled as he worked on his latest diagram. "Tell them I've discovered why every attempt to capture or contain the glints has failed. We've been thinking about them all wrong." He pulled up a holographic display showing the crystal formations across the valley. Red dots marked spots where previous research teams had tried to capture glints. Blue lines showed the paths the glints regularly traveled. "Look here," Tom said, highlighting several areas. "Every capture attempt was made near their major crystal gardens. We thought these were just random crystal formations, but they're not. They're libraries." Through his observation window, Tom watched as several glints worked on a large crystal structure. Their bodies pulsed with complex light patterns that made the crystals grow in specific shapes. The young glint that had first approached him was there too, practicing smaller patterns on a cluster of purple crystals. Libraries. Dr. Wells had joined the call, her voice skeptical but interested. "What do you mean?" Tom adjusted his scanner to show the internal structure of the crystals. "The patterns they create aren't just for growth. They're storing information inside the crystal lattices. When they send light through the crystals, they're not just communicating, they're reading." He played back a recording from the previous day. It showed a group of young glints gathered around an older one near a large crystal formation. The elder glint sent patterns of light through the crystal, and the young ones copied the patterns. "They're not aggressive predators," Tom explained, his voice full of wonder. "They're guardians. Every time we tried to capture them, we weren't just invading their territory. We were threatening their entire knowledge base." The young glint had noticed him watching and began making its way toward the observation post. Over the past few days, it had started bringing small crystal formations to show him. Tom had started calling it Scout, since it was always the first to approach with new things. "The Council will want proof," Ambassador Rax said. "Watch this," Tom replied. He took out a small crystal he had been practicing with and placed it where Scout could see it. Using his suit's lights, he created a simple pattern he had learned, the one he thought meant show or teach. Scout moved closer and examined the crystal. Then, to everyone's amazement, it carefully adjusted the crystal's position and sent a series of light pulses through it. The crystal began to grow, but not randomly. It formed a small, precise shape that matched one in Tom's drawings. "That's impossible," Dr. Wells whispered. "It's copying your research notes." "No," Tom said, grinning. "It's correcting them. I've been trying to understand their basic crystal growing patterns. Scout here has been patient enough to show me when I get things wrong." He pointed to his latest charts. "See these patterns? They're not just about growing crystals. Each formation is like a sentence in a book. The glints aren't just surviving here. They're maintaining a vast archive of knowledge, written in crystal and light." Scout had finished adjusting the crystal and backed away, waiting. Tom recognized this behavior now. It was his turn to try. He carefully copied the light pattern Scout had shown him, sending it through the crystal. The crystal grew, forming a rough but recognizable version of Scout's demonstration. The young glint's body shifted in what Tom had come to recognize as approval. "Dr. Reed," Ambassador Rax said slowly, "are you saying you've actually learned to communicate with them?" Tom watched as Scout began preparing another crystal for demonstration. "No, Ambassador. I'm saying they've decided to teach us, and I think this is just the beginning." 2 weeks into his research, Tom worked in what he now called the neutral zone, a small area between his observation post and the main crystal gardens. He had spent 3 days arranging crystals in patterns he learned from Scout, creating a space that mimicked the glint's own meeting areas. "The other research teams are starting to arrive," Dr. Wells informed him through his comm. 3 more ships had entered orbit after news of Tom's success spread. They want to know how you're doing it. Tom placed the last crystal in position and stepped back to check his work. Tell them to be patient. We can't rush this. He had learned that lesson well. Every time he tried to move too quickly in recreating the glint's patterns, Scout would spend hours showing him how to correct his mistakes. The young glint had become not just a teacher, but something close to a research partner. Look at this, Tom said, transmitting video from his suit camera. He used his lights to send a pattern through the crystal array he'd built. The crystals lit up one by one, creating a ripple of light that spread out in a spiral pattern. A moment later, Scout emerged from behind a nearby formation. The young glint wasn't alone this time. It had brought 3 adult glints with it. Tom held his breath, staying perfectly still as they approached his crystal arrangement. Tom, Dr. Wells warned, we've never had this many this close before. It's okay, he whispered. Watch. The adult glints moved around his crystal arrangement, their bodies shifting as they examined his work. Then one of them, larger than the others, stepped forward. It sent a pulse of light through Tom's crystals that made them glow with colors he hadn't seen before. They're adding to it, Tom said excitedly, his scanner recording everything. The pattern I built, it was like a sentence with missing words. They're filling in the gaps. The large glint turned toward Tom and created a complex series of light patterns. Scout moved between them and repeated the patterns more slowly, in the simpler way it had been using to teach Tom. It's like Scout is translating, Tom realized. The adults speak too quickly and complexly for me to follow, so Scout breaks it down. More glints began emerging from the crystal gardens, gathering at a respectful distance. Tom's scanner counted 20, then 30, then more. None showed any signs of aggression. Instead, they began arranging themselves in a large circle around the neutral zone. Dr. Reed, Ambassador Rax's voice came through the comm, tense with excitement. The Council has never seen behavior like this from the glints. What's happening? Tom watched in amazement as each glint in the circle began contributing to a light pattern that flowed through his crystal arrangement. Colors rippled and danced, making the crystals grow and change. His simple arrangement was becoming something much more complex and beautiful. I think, Tom said slowly, they're showing me what this pattern was meant to be. Scout wasn't just teaching me their language. It was helping me build a meeting place. The pattern completed, and the large glint approached Tom again. It carefully placed a new crystal at his feet, one that glowed with a soft, steady light. Scout moved forward and demonstrated a simple pattern, one Tom had never seen before. They're inviting me to add to their library, Tom whispered, his voice full of awe. This isn't just a bridge between our species anymore. They're offering to share their knowledge with us. As the twin suns set, casting rainbow reflections through the crystal formations, Tom realized he was standing in the middle of a moment that would change human and glint history forever. Not through force or capture, but through patience, respect, and the willingness to learn. 1 month into his stay on NS 227, Tom sat cross-legged in the neutral zone, surrounded by crystal formations that now glowed with a soft, constant light. His notebook was filled with drawings of light patterns, each carefully labeled with its meaning. Temperature stable. Crystal growth rate optimal. His suit's AI reported as Tom adjusted the environmental controls around his workspace. The glints had taught him that their crystals grew best in specific conditions. Scout approached, carrying what looked like a newly grown crystal cluster. Over the past weeks, the young glint had developed a habit of bringing Tom something new to study each morning. Behind Scout, 2 adult glints watched with what Tom had learned to recognize as pride. "Good morning, Scout," Tom said, accompanying his words with a light pattern that meant "greet friend." His suit's lights weren't as precise as the glint's natural abilities, but they had learned to understand his slightly clumsy attempts at their language. Scout responded with a complex pattern that Tom now knew meant "learning continues good." The crystal cluster Scout carried began to pulse with soft light patterns, a new form of communication Tom hadn't seen before. Dr. Reed, Dr. Wells called through the comm. The new research teams are requesting permission to set up observation posts of their own. Tom watched as Scout carefully placed the crystal cluster in front of him. Tell them they need to learn the greeting patterns first. The glints need to know they're here to learn, not capture. The crystal cluster suddenly projected a three-dimensional image into the air, a perfect miniature of the surrounding crystal garden. Tom gasped in surprise, and Scout's body shifted in what he now recognized as their version of pleasure at teaching something new. "Are you seeing this?" Tom asked, making sure his suit's cameras were recording. "They don't just store information in the crystals, they can project it." The hologram shifted, showing the growth of the crystal garden over time. Tom watched in amazement as years of crystal formation played out in minutes. Scout sent a pattern through the cluster that meant history knowledge share. "This is incredible," Dr. Wells breathed through the comm. "They're showing us their architectural history." More glints gathered around, each contributing light patterns that added new details to the hologram. Tom recognized the teaching pattern they used with their young ones, but now it was being directed at him. "They're not just letting us study them anymore," Tom said, carefully recording everything. "They're actively teaching us their technology. Scout, can you show me how this works?" The young glint's body rippled with what Tom had learned was their expression of happiness. Scout began a slow, careful demonstration of how to send the right light patterns into the crystal cluster. Other glints added their own patterns, building a complete lesson. Tom noticed something fascinating in their teaching method. When he made mistakes, they never showed frustration. Instead, they would break down the pattern into simpler parts, letting him master each piece before moving on. It was the same patient approach he had used when first trying to communicate with them. "Ambassador Rax," Tom called through his comm. "I think I understand now why the glints were considered so dangerous. It wasn't because they were aggressive. It was because everyone was trying to take their knowledge by force instead of letting them share it willingly." The hologram shifted again, showing crystal formations Tom had never seen before. Scout sent a pattern meaning future build together, followed by one Tom translated as human friend learn. As the twin suns reached their midday peak, Tom realized he wasn't just learning to communicate with the glints. He was helping to build a bridge between two civilizations, and it had all happened because he chose to be patient, to observe, and to learn instead of trying to control. "Tell the research teams," Tom said to Dr. Wells, "that their first lesson begins tomorrow. The glints have offered to teach us, but we have to do it their way, with respect, patience, and peace." 2 months had passed since Tom's first contact with the glints. The neutral zone had grown into a bustling research center, with crystal formations carefully arranged in teaching circles. 5 other human scientists had joined him, each paired with a glint teacher following Scout's example. "The Council has never seen anything like this," Ambassador Rax said, his hologram floating in Tom's observation post. "Other species are requesting permission to send their own research teams." Tom watched through the window as Scout worked with a group of human scientists, teaching them how to grow information crystals. The young glint had become an expert at bridging the gap between species. "What do the glints think about having more visitors?" Tom asked, sending the question through his crystal communicator, a gift from the glints that let him speak with them across distances. The large glint elder, whom Tom now knew as the keeper of their main crystal library, sent back a pattern that meant growth through sharing. Scout added a simpler pattern, "More friends good." "They're willing to teach anyone who comes with respect and patience," Tom translated for the ambassador. "But we need to maintain the protocols we've established. No quick answers, no shortcuts." Outside, one of the new human scientists had successfully grown her first information crystal. The glints around her pulsed with congratulatory light patterns, and Scout added a special pattern that Tom recognized as teacher pride. "Look at this," Tom said, activating a hologram from his latest crystal project. It showed the complex social structure of the glint community. something no other species had ever documented before. They're not just teaching us their technology. They're sharing their entire culture with us. The hologram shifted to show how the glints raised their young, tended their crystal gardens, and preserved their knowledge. It was a complete picture of a civilization that everyone had misunderstood for centuries. We found something interesting in the deep scans, Dr. Wells added, joining the conversation. The crystals they use for their libraries, they're not just storing information. They're improving it over time, like a living database that grows and evolves. Tom nodded, watching as Scout demonstrated a particularly complex light pattern to the new researchers. That's why they were so protective. These crystals contain the collected knowledge of their entire species. Every time we tried to capture them or take their crystals, we were threatening their civilization's memory. A group of young glints approached the observation post, carrying newly grown crystals. It was their way of offering new knowledge, something they now did regularly with the human researchers. Each crystal contained different lessons: science, history, art, or culture. The council wants to know what changed, Ambassador Rax said. Why did they choose to share their knowledge now, after centuries of isolation? Tom smiled as Scout came to join the young glints, its crystalline form glowing with friendly patterns. We stopped trying to take their knowledge and started earning their trust. It turns out the galaxy's most dangerous predators were really its most patient teachers. We just had to learn how to be good students. The young glints arranged their crystals in a pattern Tom recognized. It was the symbol for future together. Scout added a crystal of its own, completing the pattern. When activated, it showed a hologram of humans and glints working together, building something greater than either species could create alone. As the twin suns began to set, casting their light through the forest of crystal formations, Tom realized that this was more than just a research breakthrough. It was proof that the most powerful force in the universe wasn't strength or technology. It was the willingness to listen, learn, and trust. 3 months after Tom Reed first set foot on Innis 227, the planet had become the most important scientific outpost in the known galaxy. Representatives from 12 different species had gathered to learn from the glints, each following the protocols Tom had established. The council is ready for your final report, Ambassador Rax said, standing beside Tom in the main crystal garden. For the first time, the ambassador had come in person rather than by hologram. Tom watched as Scout led a mixed group of aliens through a teaching session. The young glint had grown noticeably since their first meeting, its crystalline form now showing the more complex patterns of an adult. I'm not sure I'm the one who should give it, Tom replied, smiling. Scout, would you like to show the ambassador what we've learned? Scout's form pulsed with happy light patterns as it approached them. The glint activated a large crystal formation in the center of the garden, and suddenly the air filled with the most complex hologram Tom had ever seen. It showed the history of the glints, but not as anyone had expected. The crystal creatures weren't native to Innis 227. They were the last survivors of a civilization that had spanned dozens of worlds. Their crystalline forms were actually advanced technology, designed to preserve their species' knowledge through countless generations. They're living libraries, Tom explained as the hologram showed the glint's journey through space. The crystal gardens aren't just for communication or storing information. They're a backup of their entire civilization. The ambassador watched in amazement as the hologram revealed how the glints had developed their crystal technology to survive the collapse of their original worlds. All this time, we thought they were dangerous predators. Instead, they were archaeologists and scholars, Tom finished. They were protecting humanity's greatest treasure, knowledge itself. Scout added its own light patterns to the hologram, showing how the glints had waited for centuries, testing each species that came to their world. They were looking for a civilization that would appreciate their knowledge rather than try to steal it. And we passed the test, the ambassador asked. Tom shook his head. No, we failed it many times, but we were the first to learn from our failures, the first to send someone who wanted to understand rather than capture. The hologram shifted to show future possibilities, crystal cities where different species could come together to learn, share, and grow. The glints had been preserving their knowledge not just for themselves, but for anyone who proved worthy of receiving it. The council will want to establish formal diplomatic relations, the ambassador said, watching as groups of aliens and glints work together in the garden. They already have something better, Tom replied. He pointed to where Scout was teaching a young alien child how to grow their first information crystal. The glints don't care about formal treaties. They care about the willingness to learn, to be patient, and to respect knowledge. As if to prove his point, Scout finished its lesson and came to join them, carrying a special crystal. It was smaller than the others, but glowed with an inner light that Tom had never seen before. Using the crystal communicator, Scout sent a message that made Tom's eyes widen. "Time share great secret." "What is it?" the ambassador asked, noticing Tom's expression. "They're ready to show us something," Tom said quietly. "Something they've never shared with any other species." Scout placed the crystal in Tom's hands and sent one final pattern: friends become family. As the crystal began to glow brighter, Tom realized that this was just the beginning. Humanity hadn't tamed the galaxy's most dangerous predators. Instead, they had proven themselves worthy of joining a civilization that had been waiting millennia to share its wisdom. All because one person chose to observe and learn rather than capture and control. The crystal activated, and the greatest chapter in human history began to unfold.